my screen not sharing?
It is sharing, Chris.
Okay, super. Thanks, everybody, and welcome for webinar 7 of our 9-part webinar series. Today's webinar is on impact reduction strategies for birds and bats. A few housekeeping notes. You'll be muted throughout the webinar. If you're having issues with your computer audio, there's an option to call in with your phone. And in the control panel, if you go to the audio tab, the call-in number and access code will be provided there. We have a great list of speakers for today, and I'd like to just remind everyone that to assume positive intent for our speakers for today's webinar and throughout the series. We are discussing complex issues with respect to wind energy and wildlife, and trying to get perspectives from a bunch of different stakeholders. If all goes as planned, we should have plenty of time for questions and answers, and there's a question feature on the control panel. So as we go through the presentations, if you have a question for our speakers, please feel free to type that in and we'll get to as many as possible. For information on wind energy and wildlife, I encourage you to go to the TETHIS website. There you can do a literature search for whatever topic you're interested in. You can sign up for TETHIS Blast, which are a biweekly newsletter that provides the latest on events and current literature as well. Our first 6 webinars are posted on TETHIS. The links here, you can also find the links in the events calendar on the website. And after this webinar, we have 2 others planned. The next one is scheduled for November 10th at 3 o'clock Eastern, and we'll cover the economics of wind energy. And then our last one is a more forward-looking discussion on wind energy and wildlife issues, and we're still working out the logistics for the timing of that webinar. So, aside from myself, we have 3 additional speakers who have a wealth of experience working with technologies and impact reduction strategies. Kai Skald-Nielsen is an independent consultant. Greg Aldrich is a lead environmental scientist at Duke Energy Renewables, and Amber Shorg is a biologist at the Illinois-Iowa Ecological Services Office for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So I'm going to start off giving a brief overview of impact reduction strategies and results for bats and eagles, and then hand it off to Kai, who will be followed by Greg and Amber, and then we'll have time for questions and answers from our speakers. To start with the overview, I'm going to begin by talking about bat impact reduction strategies. Here we kind of have 2 different paths. One for trying to keep bats from interacting with wind turbines in the use of deterrents, and the other is slowing down turbine blades or curtailing turbine blades to prevent mortalities when risk is high. So to begin with deterrence, the idea here is to create a uncomfortable or disorienting signal that disrupts bats' echolocation, hopefully to prevent them from wanting to be in the airspace and around the rotor swept area. And deterrents that have been studied here in the U.S. are primarily focused on the characteristic frequency of as many species as possible in the U.S. And this generally ranges from 20 to 50 kilohertz. One of the challenges with respect to ultrasound is that it doesn't transmit very far or long distances. So the higher the frequency, the shorter the distance traveled at a given decibel level. And so on the bottom right here, you see a deterrent signal that, when measured near the source, can be really high, over 120 decibels, which is equivalent to a jet engine, a really loud signal. But as the sound dissipates, higher frequencies kind of drop off faster than lower frequencies. And so given the set of conditions, and say we were trying to achieve a 55 decibel level to deter bats, a 50 kilohertz signal might only travel, roughly 25 or so meters. For eastern red bats, which have a characteristic frequency of about 30 kilohertz, that signal may travel just over 40 meters. And for hoary bats, which have a lower characteristic frequency, closer to 20 kilohertz, the sound will travel just over, or around 65 meters. So you can see that with nacelle-mounted deterrents, some of the frequencies that bats are echolocating, the deterrent signal may not reach the entire length of the blade. When we tested these devices in preliminary field settings where bat activity is high, such as ponds, we've seen really great results. And just as an example, if we look at a set of video images on the right-hand side, we see on the kind of upper left image, this is a compilation of bat activity over a 5-minute period under controlled conditions. So you see a lot of green in that image, representing a lot of bat activity. And in the subsequent 5 minutes after we turn the deterrent on, you see very little activity designated in red. And you can run a number of these trials of control and treatment conditions, and you see consistent results. You see a dramatic drop-off in bat activity when the deterrent is on. And so that led us to believe that using ultrasound, or artificially emitting ultrasound from these devices, we could reduce bat activity and thus bat fatality at wind turbines. But when we have placed these devices on top of wind turbines and done experimental studies, we've seen results vary by species. So oftentimes we might have an overall reduction in mortality, and we might see reductions for certain species. It's not a universal across all bats. So as an example here, from a study done in South Texas, we saw a 56% reduction in mortality for Brazilian free-tailed bats, 78% reduction in mortality for hoary bats. But for yellow bats, there was no difference between treatment and control conditions. Kind of along the same vein here, a study conducted in the Midwest over a couple of years. Again, we see variation in how well the deterrent technology works across species, and even within a species there can be variation. And the results shown here are not specific to a deterrent technology or location. We see this kind of across the board, particularly with poor results, or relatively poor results, for eastern red bats. And so there's a lot of work that needs to continue to find out why we see these differences. How are different species of bats responding to deterrent signals? There's still a lot of work to see, what is the best placement, what's the best signal to deter bats from wind turbines. So some ongoing research is necessary to improve upon these technologies. The other impact reduction strategy that's being investigated is curtailment. And as I mentioned, this is preventing the blades from spinning at high RPMs when bats are at risk. And fortunately, the time and conditions which the highest risk levels occur for bats is relatively narrow. Obviously, it's only at night. It's based on hundreds of mortality studies and activity studies. It tends to occur in late summer and fall and under relatively low wind speed conditions. And so if you were to set up a curtailment strategy based on the time and wind speed alone, this is referred to as blanket curtailment and has shown significant reductions in mortality. There is some variation, and some of this depends on the cut-in speed selected. But even within a cut-in speed, you can have somewhat varying results. But overall, we've definitely seen significant reductions in mortality. The problem, however, is that there's a lot of time when turbines are curtailed and bats aren't at risk under blanket curtailment scenarios. And so this is unnecessary. We're not doing anything for bats if they're not at risk, and we're not producing renewable energy. And so efforts have been made to kind of fine-tune the strategy by incorporating other weather variables such as temperature, or using modeled or real-time bat activity to inform curtailment strategies. And when we take anything in addition to kind of the baseline of time and wind speed conditions and add it to a curtailment strategy, we refer to this as a smart curtailment. And again, the goal here is to not only reduce mortality, but really to limit the loss of revenue and power generation, and achieve goals for both conservation and renewable energy production. And there's been some effort to incorporate or to investigate smart curtailment strategies, primarily using temperature. So there's been some research investigating smart curtailment strategies, and there's ongoing efforts, of course. And then there's been some thought into modeling bat activity and using that to inform curtailment strategies. Back in 2011, Weller and Baldwin discussed, being able to look at bat activity in relationship to weather variables and adjusting it to develop site or region specific strategies. In Germany, they have been using algorithms for bat activity to inform curtailment for some time. And Trevor Peterson has talked about this quite a bit and has some papers related to this in review. And then last year, a publication from a multi-year study came out using the timer system, which bases curtailment off of real-time bat activity. So as bats are being recorded, the data is analyzed in real time to determine whether bats are present, and then informs the turbines to curtail. And this study has shown or showed a great reduction in mortality based on the parameters from the study. But it is one study, and additional research is necessary to validate the technology and the system. And both for deterrence and for smart curtailment, there's a lot of research going on underway. Several studies are looking at the cell-mounted deterrence. There's also technologies exploring blade-mounted deterrence, and also trying to get at the question of what signal works for a variety of species. And with respect to smart curtailment, again, there's a number of research studies going on. And I've included some links here for websites that have, or for webinars that have reviewed these studies and the plans for these studies. So they're all kind of in early stages of research, and all funded by the Department of Energy to explore these strategies. There's also just a lot of other types of technologies being explored. The USGS is looking at the use of dim UV light to reduce bad activity around wind turbines. And there's other blade-mounted deterrent technologies that are being explored. So these are kind of in earlier stages of development and research, but we kind of need this innovative thinking and different strategies so that we can have different options for different settings. Moving on to eagles, there's some recent work from Purdue University looking at just how eagles visually perceive their environment. They found that eagles have a rather large blind spot on the top of their heads, and so if they're soaring or flying and are focused on the ground, they may not see what's in front of them, and they may not anticipate that there's any sort of obstruction in front of them, which may lead to collision. So this is just important basic biology that helps us understand why eagles may be interacting with wind turbines. The study also found that it's unlikely that both bald and golden eagles can detect UV light, but there are colors that are visible to these birds that may be useful as sort of a visual warning or deterrent system. A recent publication that came out about a month ago spoke to the painting of one of the turbine blade to reduce fatalities, and knowing kind of the basic biology of these animals and maybe what colors they respond to might inform some sort of strategy if we were to further explore painting turbine blades as a potential strategy. But there's still a lot to be worked out with that type of impact reduction strategy. A lot of logistics, permits, and feasibility of doing something like that at a large scale. There are a couple of strategies that use camera systems to first detect whether an eagle is present, and then based off of that information result in an action. So with respect to the detection and identification aspect, both Identiflight and DT Bird have a camera system and use some sort of algorithm or identification process to classify an object as an eagle or not. And then once that classification is made, then there's a response. And with respect to Identiflight, that response is to curtail a wind turbine or a string of turbines. And early results show that this camera system, this technology, has performed better at recognizing eagles relative to human observers, particularly at greater distances, and that the classification time frame was near instantaneous. And so that's really encouraging. And there's more information on this technology. If you go into the AWWI's website, there's a summary of early results as well as a publication that you can access for further reading. For DT Bird, rather than curtailing, once an eagle is classified, the action here is to deter the eagle's approach towards a wind turbine. And here there are two audible signals that are emitted based on a threshold distance. So as, say, an eagle is approaching and it's identified at a given distance, a warning signal is emitted. If the eagle continues on its path, then a second signal, a dissuasion signal, is emitted to prevent the bird from continuing on its approach. Early studies showed a 63% successful detection rate. There were some issues with sun glare with the cameras They also showed a deterrence rate of up to 83%. But there was a high number of false positives in early studies with DT bird that resulted in unnecessary deterrent signaling. And subsequent research is working towards improving the technology. And again, on AWWI's website, you can see a summary of early results or preliminary studies, as well as a technical report. Lastly, with respect to eagles and the idea of deterring them from wind turbines, both the University of Minnesota and Purdue University have looked at the hearing capabilities of eagles. And for the University of Minnesota, the hearing range centered on 2 kilohertz. They also determined that red-tailed hawks are a suitable surrogate for field testing, which is helpful, and that sounds with varying frequency and volume pattern may achieve the strongest response or the least habituated response. Purdue University found that both bald and golden eagles respond strongly to tones of between 0.5 and 5 kilohertz. So this is very similar to what the University of Minnesota found. In the Purdue study, they showed that bald eagles were good at processing rapid sounds and amplitude modulations, but golden eagles were not very good at processing those types of sounds. And their suggestion was that for both of these species, using complex sounds with fairly slow frequency modulations might work best for a deterrent signal, something that both species of eagles would respond to. So with that overview, I'll hand it off to Kai and our other presenters to speak to different aspects of integrating technologies and conducting research. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I was just muted here. So thank you very much to NREL and to Chris for putting this together. And it's a very important subject. And I need to state that what I present here are my own views and not the views of anybody that I'm working for. And I also want to say that I worked in the Altamont in the 80s, so there's a little bit of a personal stake in this. That was not fun to be part of, and I really want to make sure that I do as much as I can to try to improve this situation. So can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. So we come at this from many different backgrounds, and all the way from a domain where people are mostly focused on reducing the wildlife impact to regulators who are specifically represented today, down to the domain where people are mostly focused on selling more product. And for all of us, it's important that the integration of detection and deterrent systems are relatively smooth and can be done effectively in order to both satisfy many of the desires that we are, or the backgrounds that we're coming from here. So to start out with where we are and where we want to be, there are a lot of detection and deterrent systems coming onto the market, like Chris just showed in his deck. And when we do the integration of all of these, there are some technical things I think it's important to understand from a turbine perspective. And it's my hope that being transparent and sharing some of these technical considerations from the field will help regulators gain additional insights and both give them a better understanding for what's happening out in the field, and also possibly impact some of the rules and regulations so that they become as well as we can make them. On the technical details, especially for mitigation, the wind speed on the site is new. Here are a few details about the wind speed that I want to highlight. On the illustration, right? So on the illustration to the right, you can see that the anemometer is highlighted behind the rotor up on top of the nacelle. So the reading that is produced by this anemometer will be impacted by the topology and the terrain. If the wind comes slightly from below, if it comes straight in on the turbine, or if it comes slightly from above, it will generate slightly different readings. And similarly, on the little illustration below, the wind shear is, I'm trying to represent with arrows here, that we have a lower wind speed at the ground level than we do up higher. And so the single point measurement behind the rotor gives a representation of what is happening in that single point. It may not truly reflect what's happening at the tip speed on the high level and the tip speed at the lower level. So a single point measurement is really a representation of the value, but not a scientific measurement of the wind speed. So this may impact how it's used also for regulatory regimes if we use the wind speed. The anemometer serves a purpose in the turbine for making sure that the turbine tracks the wind and that it shuts off safely when the high wind speed is reached. So that's a different purpose than what we're trying to use it for at the very low wind speeds. Another technical detail for both birds and bats is that collision mitigation currently uses issuing stop commands to the turbines. So there are some different variations on these stop commands. So I'm trying to illustrate this with just 3 different stop types: the emergency stop, the remote stop, and the wildlife stop. The emergency stop, of course, is as fast as it's possible to do it on the turbine. The remote stop may be a little bit slower. And if the turbine model has the wildlife stop capability, that could be a dedicated stop type with a more gentle stop if that's possible, but a stop type that can be modified without impacting the other types for simplification. Stopping the turbines has different impacts, and there are different turbine models. There are older turbines that have a mechanical brake. There are turbines that can feather out. And typically the turbines that can feather out don't come to a complete stop. They come down to a slow idle because that's best for the mechanical system. And how often the stop is issued, of course, is important for the mechanical structure of the turbine. If it's stopped very frequently at low wind speed, it may have a different impact than if it's stopped frequently at a high wind speed. And there's also a signal delay and response time. If the signal comes from a third-party external system, it typically would go into the SCADA system. Then there's a communication delay before it's transmitted to the turbine or arrives at the turbine, and then there's a execution delay out in the turbine controller. So wind power plants are laid out in many different ways with different types of infrastructure, and the signal delays are a consequence of some of the choices that are made. There are systems that update every 30 seconds. There are systems that update down to 100 milliseconds or faster. just because of the data infrastructure in the wind power plant. And then you have different delays out in the turbine controller, again, determined by the type of controller and the model and the mechanical capability of that machine. The response time needs to be aligned with the detection system if you have a detection system. So we need to have a detection range that allows for all these transmission delays before the turbine can respond, in order to ensure that the species that we're talking about and trying to protect doesn't reach the rotor before it has been brought to a stop. Again, with multiple third-party vendors developing detection and deterrent systems, the interface to the SCADA system becomes a task that needs to be achieved every time we develop a new project or upgrade to new systems. So currently there are no real standard tag names or designs for how these signals should be specified. And we may, in the near future, reach a product maturity where it would make sense to begin to standardize some of these. If the names were systematic and standardized, it could potentially simplify the integration of a new vendor equipment or upgrading to a newer version or anything like that. And there could be other signals, not just necessarily start and stop commands. It could be also situation awareness about the detection or deterrent system. It could be system health, maintenance, and potentially other tag names. And there are some illustrations of potential names here. This is done with sort of a IEC 61400-25 sort of domain in mind, and these names could be compatible with that type of standard. It all comes down to cost and risk of failure and technical problems when you are into the operations. And operators in wind power plants are categorized as critical infrastructure in the US and Canada. And this means that they fall under the NERC CIP data security requirements. So these new technologies need to have that in mind under the product development, so that they come out ready to be integrated into these systems that have these data security requirements. A detection or deterrent system, because it's able to start and stop the turbines, it would be possible to potentially impact the grid if these were abused or hacked or compromised somehow. And it's important that the data security is really considered relatively early in the process, so we don't end up with a system that's very good at protecting the wildlife, but it can't be distributed or installed at a broad scale because it wouldn't meet the requirements of the owners and operators. Sorry, I missed a. So stop types, again, there are many different models of turbines. So the impact of issuing the commands will be different. And it's important to have stability. That means that when third-party companies introduce start and stop commands, they need to think about if the duration of the command makes sense. It doesn't help to send a stop command to a turbine when you intend to only have it stop for 1 minute if it takes 5 minutes to stop, or if it takes 2 minutes or 5 minutes to start, and you only give the turbine shorter period to be actually started. So there is some stability consideration when turbine manufacturers give access to these commands via remote. There's a ramp rate impact because we could potentially stop a large number of turbines. The whole plant would ramp the power down faster than maybe the grid is ready for. We're talking about offshore plants on the gigawatt scale, and wind power plants can typically respond in a few seconds. So if you have about a gigawatt that cuts out in 10 seconds, that has a good impact that needs to be considered somewhere. And the other part is market commitment. The operators and owners have some sort of commitment to meet a commercial obligation, and that needs to be considered. Sorry, there we go. And again, there are the plot on the right sort of shows the number of wildlife stops I have collected from a small subset of turbines. And in this case here, we reached 70,000 stops in 1 year. So it's a significant number of stops, and you can see that the number of countries where stops are being deployed is beginning to grow. It used to be almost only US and Canada, and now it's spreading globally. And I didn't specifically include the duration here, but the number of hours is getting to be significant. And as Chris referred to earlier, during some of those hours, there were probably very minimal risk to the bats, posing a little bit of a challenge to the strategy that's used here. And all the stops, of course, is a commercial risk, and it's beginning to spill into the decision to build in some places in Germany right now. My understanding is that several projects are on hold simply because the people who are going to finance it don't quite understand what the risks are for them if the project will be stopped so much that there's no commercial viability for the project. And the only real way to harvest the entire, especially for bats, is really a good deterrent. And of course, a good deterrent for eagles would be attractive as well. So other subjects I didn't mention include health and safety, of course, for all the people working around these systems. And from a turbine manufacturer perspective, what kind of power needs are required? These turbines are so optimized, there's not excessive amount of power outlets available. It all requires modification to the controllers and installation of additional transformers. Wiring and electrical compatibility is a concern. Equipment mounted on the blades is a big technical concern. And equipment mounted on the nacelle is a concern because it could potentially impact the wind speed reading that we already have some uncertainty on because it sits behind the rotor. And of course, the control stability, as I mentioned before, with the frequent start and stop are a concern. And that's the last slide for me.
Thank you, Kai.
I would pass the presentation on to Greg. So.
All right. Assume you can hear me now.
Yes, we can hear you.
Greg.
Confirmation. All right. Thank you. Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're at. Thank you all. Thank you to NREL and Defenders of Wildlife for putting this on and allowing me to participate. At Duke, we've actually installed 2 different types of technologies, specifically the NRG Systems Bat Deterrent System, and another one some of you may have heard of, the Identiflight system. They're both available. These are what we're familiar with. There are other technologies that are available also, but this is what, again, Duke is familiar with. The issues that I'm going to talk about will probably be applied pretty broadly to other technologies. I'm a little jealous that Chris's photo of this system is better than mine, but a little history behind the Bat Deterrent System. In 2016, Sarah Weaver, who is now Dr. Sarah Weaver, came to us. She was working with BCI at the time with a proposal. NRG Systems had a system ready to deploy. Vestas, the OEM, was a willing participant, and it turns out this is very important. If your OEM, your turbine manufacturer, does not buy into what you want to do, the holes you want to cut into their system or into their turbine, it's not going to work. Sarah was able to get a grant from Texas Parks and Wildlife, and that covered the deterrent portion of the study. We were planning already to do Tier 4A studies, and those are post-construction fatality monitoring studies. This is part of our commitment to the wind energy guidelines. The cost for that, which is a pretty big cost, is already budgeted for, so that really helps. So in essence, the stars had aligned on all of this, and we were ready to go. There is a publication. I'm not going to go into the results of the study, but there is a publication, and it's right there. I believe you'll be able to get to that later if needed. So Chris covered this pretty good, so I'm not going to go into it other than a little detail on the specifics of the system. There are 6 different frequencies to mimic the local bats, and it's important that you get those frequencies right. You don't want to be broadcasting frequency for a bat that doesn't even live in that area. Effectively, it creates an airspace where we assume bats will have difficulty echolocating and finding their way around, finding prey, finding others of the same species. It's presumed that they don't want to be in those areas, and I think it's you can go a little bit beyond presumed. It's probably been proven at this point. The other system is Identiflight. We've installed 47 units at our top of the world wind site in Wyoming, not too far from Casper. It consists of image sensor arrays. There are 8 low definition lenses. You can see those on the bottom portion of that picture in the upper right. And then there are 2 high magnification stereoscopic sensors, and that spins around. It'll go 360 degrees, and that's what they use to determine how far away that bird is from that sensor. It uses artificial intelligence and neural networks for all you Terminator fans. If you reference Skynet, it's kind of scary if you think about it. But this will seek out and identify eagles and other large birds, depending on who you tell it to look for. So you can program it for different species. It curtails individual turbines if the birds are determined to be at risk of a turbine blade collision. And it's programmable based on site characteristics. And Kai actually mentioned this. Different turbines take longer to slow down when you can curtail them. Some of them might take 20 seconds, some of them might take up to a minute. So you have to program how you use your system, your Identiflight system, based on what that turbine is capable of doing. The history behind the Identiflight system, in about 2014, RES was involved. That's another wind developer. They came up with the idea for Identiflight. They contacted us about being a host. They installed a prototype in February of 2015. That's the upper photo there. We actually mounted it on our Eagle observation tower. After less than a year, the data came in, and it was so promising that we installed 4 beta units in early 2016. And by the end of 2016, we were already doing a proof of performance test. Again, I won't go into the results of that test, but you can get that at the citation below. So hurdles, roadblocks, stream crossings, other challenges, testing the technology. That's first and foremost. Does it work? Is it going to perform as the vendor or the developer states it will? So we put these tests in place. There are a number of regulatory hurdles depending on where you're located. South Texas, it's not as big a deal as it would be in, say, Oregon. You might need a stormwater protection plan, depending on if you're going to do any excavation. You might need a permit to do that excavation. Road use, or you may need to build roads. Do you need a scientific collection permit from your state entities? Do you need to transport live animals, which doesn't really figure into the research itself, but if you injure an animal, it'll need to be transported, you'll need a permit. And then the all-important SPUC permit to actually collect birds that may be found underneath the turbines. Regulated species, BGIPA's an issue. Will you be working with eagles? Will you need a permit, an incidental take permit? ESA issues. Is there a risk of take of a listed species? And then, of course, MBTA. A lot of different issues to think about. And if there is a risk of take of a regulated species, this could be a deal killer for any host site. It brings into the question, if you have a take of a regulated species during a research project, is that different from incidental take during normal operations if the research project doesn't increase the chance of take? I just throw that question out there for you. So just some photos of the inside of a nacelle this is for the installation of the bat deterrent systems. So you need site preparation. You need to install these units. A lot of cases, the technology developer does not install. So you have to find somebody to do the installation. Are you going to use a contractor? Or are you going to self-install? We chose to self-install at our site down in South Texas, but we're talking 200. Well, at the time we installed 16, so it's a learning process. Now we're going to install 255 units at all of the turbines. It's kind of a big deal. You have to actually get up in the turbine. There's not a whole lot of room. You have to cut holes, you install it. There's a lot of penetrations. If you don't have your OEM support on this, you're not going to get anywhere. You might end up gluing them to the outside. And then you got to determine if the glue is compatible with the surface of the nacelle. This is the external view of those bat deterrent units. This is taken, the one on the left is taken from the bottom, from the ground, and you can see that they're fairly small in relation. I did get a better picture on the upper right there, but there are 6 speakers on those, and each one of those speakers emits a different frequency. And then there's actually 3 of them on top of the turbine nacelle, and then 2 underneath, so for 5 total. When we first started the research project, we had 6 on it. They actually pointed one off the back, but they determined that that wasn't necessary. And then the beta unit installation of Identiflight, not something to be taken lightly either, keeping in mind that the beta units were installed temporarily. They weren't going to be there permanently, but there's still a good bit of work to be done. And just as kind of a side note, we did hire, for Identiflight, it's a big issue. There are kind of several steps to getting it installed. It's very complex, and the more complex the technology is, the more important it is that you get it installed right. So we had several units that were installed with improper grounding, and a lightning strike nearby fried 4 of the units, which came back on us to fix. So it's important to get it right the first time. There's a lot of excavation involved. You have to run cable. You don't know where you're going to get your power. Kai mentioned that. You can see on the right there, that bottom right photo, that's the original transformer and box. That's much smaller now. Things have gotten much better in the technology. This is a big one, wildlife fatality monitoring. Will this be required during testing? How much effort is required? It's going to depend on what you're looking for. Bats or eagles are much easier to see than bats, of course. Bats will likely require more extensive mowing of search plots. It is, it's very expensive. There are landowner and wildlife agency concerns. If you have to remove crops or have a landowner not put in crops, somebody's got to pay for those crops, and that'll fall on the host facility. Actually, in Texas, there was a big concern because we had to go out 100 meters because these were pretty good sized turbines. 100 meters is a big area. That's a lot of acreage to mow. There was intact habitat that went out beyond the original pad, the original area where the turbine was put, and the Texas Parks and Wildlife was concerned about us having to remove that intact habitat in addition, just for the monitoring. It has to be mowed frequently to maintain 4 inches of length. Of course, eagles will be much different. You can find them in a foot of grass, but you're gonna have a little more trouble finding a bat. And another thing is, will daily searches be required? For eagles, you can go out and search monthly, at least in the areas I'm familiar with, and there's a very high likelihood that eagle will still be there. However, for bats, it's probably gonna disappear relatively quickly, usually within about 7 to 14 days. You need to get out much more frequently to do your searches. So, convincing management. You've done all your testing. You've shown that, yes, the technology works. Now we want to install it. So now we've got to convince our management. This is a huge leap of faith for the business folks because we're talking about millions of dollars to install it. They asked a lot of questions I don't even think about. Will this continue to work 5 years down the road? For me, the biggest issue is a biological one. Will there be habituation? Will bats habituate to these frequencies that we're emitting? Will they just decide that they can turn off their echolocation and not even worry about it? It's not an issue for eagles unless you're trying to deter. Personally, I think eagles are going to be a bigger issue for habituation than bats are, but we're only 2 years into our install project. We won't know for a few more years whether or not bats will habituate. How long is this technology going to last? It's up on top of a turbine nacelle, or it's out in the middle of Wyoming. Weather is brutal on these things. How long is it going to last? Is it going to get blown off or blown over? What's the maintenance going to look like? And it turns out for some of these, maintenance is an issue. This is what management asks. Will this company be in business in 5 years? Is this their only gig? Is this all they do? If this fails, will they be around for us to go ask for help? And bottom line is, if more companies don't buy into the technology, it may drive those companies into bankruptcy. They may not be able to survive. Does the technology need to be integrated into the wind site operating system? So if you're going to curtail turbines, that's a yes. Bat deterrent systems typically don't curtail turbines. So no, we didn't have to integrate, but there are some issues with communication. We still need to check the health of that bat deterrent system. For smart curtailment, yeah, you have to be, because you have to tell the turbine to curtail. Identify, yes, that's what it's all about. See the bird, shut your turbine down. So there's a big connection issue there. So they've already talked about SCADA. It's a control system architecture that operates the site. It's very complicated. I don't even pretend to understand it. It's not just limited to electricity production. So a lot of manufacturing facilities will also use a type of a SCADA system. And again, it's way beyond my know-how. So that's important. If you're going to have to curtail your turbines, you need to be into the SCADA system, and that's not an easy task. Broadband access. Do you even have it? Most of these wind farms are out in the middle of nowhere. A lot of folks out there that might not even have internet, and you're going to bring internet in for yourself just so that you can communicate with your turbines. How will the data transfer occur? Will it be fiber or wireless? At our identified system in Wyoming, it is a wireless system. We don't have fiber run for everything, so they have to communicate through wireless. Typically, also, because of cybersecurity issues, the technology vendor's system cannot touch the wind site system. So they say, so how's it going to work? How are you going to curtail? They do need to talk to each other. So one system will send a signal to the other one, and this just basically a 1 or a 0, a yes or a no. If it says yes, curtail, your system captures that signal and sends the curtailment. That way they're not actually touching. And Kai also mentioned this, where will the electricity come from? You can't just plug into a turbine. Typically, and I can't believe this, I mean, you're producing electricity, but there's only one 110 outlet on the darn thing. And that's generally up top. There's one up top and one down below. And that's to plug a drill into. We had to hook into our transformers for the Identiflight system at top of the world, which is, now we're talking about dealing with high voltage electricity, kind of a big deal. Cybersecurity, this is a mishmash of laws and regulations. There are national security implications and grid security. It's just, a lot of folks already deal with this in everyday life. I know I do. The NERC-CIP, Kai mentioned that. Cybersecurity compliance, it's highly regulated. Again, I have to take training on it, but do I understand all the ins and outs of it? No, I do not. Sometimes our corporate cybersecurity requirements may be more stringent than what the government tells you to do. And with that, I leave you with a photo of the solar eclipse from 2017, compliments of a robot. This was taken by Identiflight. And that's all I've got. And now I turn it over to Amber.
Hello, everyone. Just bear with me a moment while I get my PowerPoint queued up here. All right. Hopefully that did the trick. Very good. Well, thank you very much to Chris and all his team there at NREL and partners for inviting me to share the Fish and Wildlife Service perspective on impact reduction strategies today. As Chris mentioned, I'm Amber Shorg with Fish and Wildlife Service out of the Illinois and Iowa Ecological Services Field Office. So just a quick rundown of what I hope to cover today. First, the role of the Fish and Wildlife Service, specifically ecological services within the wind wildlife community. I want to share with you a little bit of information about ESA take authorization mechanisms for when that applies to research, some thoughts on considerations for coordinating the research that you might be doing with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and then a little bit about the application of new impact reduction strategies into minimization or avoidance measures that your facility might have. So first of all, a little bit about where I work. I serve both Illinois and Iowa. I work primarily with endangered species, so my talk today will be focused on endangered species. I'm not able to speak to bald and golden eagle issues as I'm not a part of the migratory birds program that administers those. So I'll be deeply rooted in ecological services and T&E species today. As many of you know, Illinois and Iowa has a ton of wind. We have, I think, 16,000 megawatts installed and growing now. So I'm very interested in wind as the wheelhouse of my workload. So to that end, though, I wanted just to share with you the Fish and Wildlife Service's mission, which is working with others to conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, and plants and their habitats for the continuing benefit of the American people. And I wanted to emphasize that working with others portion. I strongly believe that the Fish and Wildlife Service has some key common goals, as the same common goals as the wind and wildlife community in general. And of course, that's conservation and recovery of federally protected species combined with ESA compliance, which is in all of our best interests, and also the conservation of non-listed wildlife, hopefully with the end of precluding listing for some of the species that are highly impacted. I think those are good goals that we all share. And then, of course, the role of the Fish and Wildlife Service in threatened and endangered species impact reduction strategies. There's kind of three key ones that I see as my role in that. First, I can provide, and the service in general can provide technical expertise on the species of interest that you might be researching or interested in and using an impact reduction strategy for. We certainly can participate in, where possible, and facilitate research on new conservation measures. I myself have prepared 4 biological opinions this year in conjunction with the Department of Energy's research on smart curtailment strategies in Iowa. And also, of course, we can provide some assistance with threatened and endangered species laws, interpreting regulations, and helping out with the permit process.
Hey, Amber?
Yes.
For some reason, your slides are truncated. And so we're only seeing, they're truncated on one side and on the bottom.
All right.
Amber, it may be because you have your screen, your slides up on a large monitor, and so if you move your PowerPoint to the smaller laptop screen, I think it will fix itself. It's a weird quirk of GoToWebinar.
You see, I am currently only on a laptop, actually.
Huh.
Is that any better if I just stick with this? With the editing view?
Yeah, at least here we can see the slides, so I think that'll work fine. Thanks.
Okay. Apologies for the technical difficulty there. So a quick introduction to some permit mechanisms that might be available, that are available to you if you are interested in researching or implementing some new impact reduction strategies at a wind facility. There's three main ones. The first one is an Endangered Species Act Section 10A1A, Research and Recovery Permit. This is a permit that is specifically for scientific purposes and to enhance the survival of a threatened or endangered species. So to this end, it's important that the research that is being conducted is directly related to the conservation and recovery of the species. That's when this particular mechanism does apply. This research this authorization mechanism involves a research permit application, a full-blown study plan. The Fish and Wildlife Service is responsible for doing the NEPA and the biological opinion, and there's also a Federal Register notice involved with that. So it seems like a lot, but hopefully these kinds of permits can be issued within a few months. Right. Hang on. Of course, Section 7 consultation can also be done when there's a federal action, such as a grant received from the Department of Energy or another federal agency to conduct research. This is conducted at the field level. This consultation is at my level here at the field, and we would prepare a biological opinion. Any kind of NEPA that's required or public notice is conducted according to the lead agency's protocols. And then, of course, there is a Section 10A1B permit, which is a permit for the incidental take to an otherwise lawful activity. So if you have a facility that has risk to an endangered species and plan to get an HCP for operation, and you want to include a new technology within that HCP, this would be the take authorization method that you would pursue. It involves the preparation of a habitat conservation plan, also NEPA, Federal Register notices, biological opinion, and the issuance of that permit itself from the Fish and Wildlife Service. All right, so that's just a quick introduction to some take authorization methods and ways that might be available to you that your local Fish and Wildlife Service folks can help you figure out if you're interested in pursuing one of those. So I wanted to share some thoughts as well about considerations for communicating research or the inclusion of an impact reduction strategy into a research plan with the Fish and Wildlife Service. One thing that I have really appreciated about the folks that have worked with me in my office in Illinois and Iowa is that they've coordinated very early with our office right at the ground level. They have a concept. They've come in to talk to myself and the other WIN staff here about what they hope to do, and we can discuss the appropriate take authorization method that might be needed for the site or for the research. And then also the strongest research plans that I have seen have really taken a multifaceted approach. As Chris explained earlier with the deterrent research, several folks have done some deterrent research in our area now, and they've pulled in not only the application of the deterrent to the wind turbines themselves, but also they incorporated the biology of the species. They've looked at the sound, how the sound interacts and is expected to interact with the bat species they were studying. They tested the deterrent unit itself out in the wild, essentially, over a pond for one of them, to see how it worked in the field on the species of interest, and then applied it to the farm scale. So I did appreciate that multifaceted approach that not only lets us know how it worked when it was tested, but also clues us into the why it might be successful, which is important when you go to apply it to a different facility or a different landscape. Another consideration is to think about the scale of the research and the scale of the intended application. So if you have a pilot study, discussing the scale of the pilot study and how you hope to incorporate it into a larger scale can kind of help inform the study plan and help inform the Fish and Wildlife Service as far as where you hope to take the technology in the future. And then, of course, clear and concise reports are very much appreciated. I have a fair bit of wind, as I mentioned before, so there's often a lot on biologists' plates. So having good summaries is great, but also the information so that I can go back and read it in detail if needed is always appreciated. And finally, I wanted to share some thoughts about actually applying a new impact reduction strategy into a permit. Specifically, I'll talk about the HCPs and some things I wanted to share with you today. Some questions that I always ask and that we all think about as we're looking to incorporate some of these into an HCP. And the first is, has this particular strategy been tested at sites in the same landscape and on the species of interest? So if you have a deterrent that has been tested in the Southwest, how comparable are those species and the echolocation frequencies of those bat species to the species that we have here in the Midwest? Are they comparable? Are they different? How might we deal with that in the context of an HCP? And then the second question that I tend to think about a bit is, how does this strategy help achieve the HCP's goals and objectives? With an HCP, you have a specific way that you want a specific goal for reducing impacts to the endangered species as a result of the activity. So are you able to quantify with reasonable certainty what that reduction in impact will be, and translate that into how it will achieve the objective of the HCP? Thirdly, how will you know if it's successful? Does your monitoring program, is that strong enough to reflect whether or not the technology has been successful in meeting those goals and objectives and meeting the percent reduction that you're after, if that be the case? Is the technology successfully performing in and of itself, not just the bird and bat fatality monitoring underneath the turbine, but also is the unit functioning properly? I think Greg had some of those same questions as well, both over the short term and then in the long term. And finally, what is the adaptive management plan? You might have to incorporate some adaptive management to plan to replace units, perhaps, or check in on how they're functioning, over a long period of time. So it's important to consider those as well. And finally, what some of you have been waiting for, what about applying a new impact reduction strategy to a TAL? And a TAL is simply an abbreviation for technical assistance letter. The service in my region often issues these for projects that are implementing avoidance measures. So the true question here is, what does it take to show that a new impact reduction strategy equals avoidance of a listed species? And that's a really tricky question. And of course, I'm not going to be able to answer that directly, because I think the community is still learning a lot about some of these new technologies and how they function. There's a difference here between incorporating a new impact reduction strategy to an HCP under a permitted situation and a TAL. And that is that with the TAL, both the company and the service is committing to stating that a particular operational regime or technology will in fact equal an avoidance. The take of a listed species will be unlikely. And that's a pretty far limb to go out onto. I think it requires a multifaceted approach, as I mentioned earlier. So looking at the weight of evidence surrounding the effectiveness of a technology, both from the species biology perspective, as well as the effectiveness that it has shown in field tests and other places. Has this particular technology been studied at a large scale, more than just a pilot project? And how can it be applied from a few turbines to a full farm, so that we can make the statement that avoidance is true for a full multi-turbine facility? And then finally, we want to make sure that we incorporate and evaluate the facility or the turbine-specific, site-specific information. So the location of a particular project may influence whether or not a technology is true avoidance. And something that comes to mind is if you are very close to a bat maternity colony, the density of bats around those turbines might be higher, as well as the risk that a new technology might not be fully effective, that might be a little bit higher as well. So something to think about there. And then finally, the technical assistance letters and statements that we agree that avoidance is likely is something that we write on behalf of the regional office. The regional office in our region, at least, has the Section 10 signatory authority, which means that we would coordinate any deviations from our current technical assistance letters with our regional office staff to ensure that they are on board as well. So to that end, I think that wraps up my portion. So I will turn it back over to the moderators and the panel for our question and answer session.
Thanks, Amber, and thanks again to Kai and Greg. And so we've got about 15 or so minutes for questions. And let me just pop up here. And we've had some come in from the audience. So this one that I have for maybe all of y'all to weigh in on is there research out there that could be done or should be done that you think might be relevant to us improving these strategies? This could relate to the wildlife side. Is there any behavioral, physiological information you wish we had a better handle on the turbine side with respect to wear and tear, maybe with starts and stops, or the technology side with respect to camera systems or machine learning? What else would you like to see the research community focus on to help move these strategies along?
Well, I would give that a shot from my end. I think one of the things that we really know very, very little about is potential attraction to turbines. I wish we knew more about if that's the case and what factors are contributing to it.
Amber, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think that seeing some of these technologies deployed, I guess I'm speaking about deterrent specifically, deployed at a farm-wide scale is perhaps the next step. I'm encouraged to see that Greg has mentioned that they're going to pursue that as well. There's also a facility in Illinois that is currently ongoing, or doing a 3-year research and a broad application, multi-turbine application of deterrence. So I think that is a key next step in being able to apply these take things from pilot studies to actually deploying them at the facility-wide scale.
Okay, Greg, any thoughts? Yeah, you're on mute.
All right. I'd like to see research done by combining technologies, especially with bats. we seem to focus on an individual technology, and I think it's going to take a toolbox, multiple different technologies to get the job done. And when one doesn't work, another one might work at the same facility at a particular time. And the WWRF, the Wind and Wildlife Research Fund, is actually looking at a lot of the biological aspects this research proposal cycle. And we're looking at things like differences in sexes. Are the females or the males being struck by the blades more often than others?
Okay, great. Greg, with respect to your experience with Identiflight, do you have a sense of how many turbines a single Identiflight unit can cover? This may vary from site to site, but I guess in your experience in using it, what was your kind of Identiflight to turbine ratio?
So it's going to depend on your site. That's the great catch-all. It depends. At top of the world, because of the topography, it's quite hilly. There's a number that Identiflight's come up with. It's called the N number. And I believe the N number is how many turbines per Identiflight unit. In the top of the world, it is unfortunately a rather small number. It's 2.7. So we got 110 turbines there and 47 Identiflight units. That's huge. If we were to put them in another site with a different topography, it might be 3, 4, or 5 turbines that you could cover. So it's going to depend on your location.
Okay. We had a question about this was specific to NRG deterrents and whether they'd been installed on blades. But just in general, maybe broadening that out is a question about deterrents on regardless of technology being installed on blades. And there are a number of technologies, both passive and powered deterrents, that are being studied for blades, but none are commercial. None have gone through very rigorous testing. They're just kind of in various stages of development. But to you all, what are some challenges you see or some opportunities you see with blade-mounted deterrents? Greg, you're smiling. You want to start off?
Sure.
I'm looking at Kai.
Well, I think everybody at this point, most people at this point, understand that the blades are relatively vulnerable and sensitive. So anything that impacts the gel coat, anything that impacts the integrity of the fiber is of concern. So mounting almost anything is difficult on the blades. The equipment that needs power needs a wire running up there mostly, and that's super sensitive. Just as Craig said about losing some Identiflight systems to lightning in the beginning, that's absolutely a concern for the rotors. They are protected against lightning to the best of the ability of the manufacturers, I suspect, but running an extra wire is just an unknown that invites trouble. And a lightning strike down a wire that's not intentional could be fatal for the blade. So those are definitely concerns. Even adding something that has color to the blade, that means that one side of the blade will expand potentially more than the other side when it's hit by the sun. And that creates some potential stress in the laminate. You can keep going, and everybody has something to be concerned about when it comes to blades.
I think if you could build and integrate it into the blade at the factory, that would be the way to go. But installing it in the field once the turbines are up, and the maintenance, we don't know what the maintenance is going to look like. It's hard to get to the tip of a blade once it's installed. It's a big deal. It's a lot bigger deal than going up to the cell and having to do maintenance on something. So I think those are the two big issues.
Okay. Amber, anything to your thoughts on blade mounted deterrents?
Yeah, I would be curious about how they would function as the blade is rotating at different speeds, and how, you know, the Doppler effect might change how that sound is perceived by the bats, and how far out that frequency of interest needs to go to help the bat avoid it. Those are some questions that I would think about.
Great. Amber, this one's specific to you, and I think you touched on it a little bit, but the question is the service open to using more abundant species as surrogates to determine the effectiveness of a strategy? And so one example is if deterrents are determined to be effective for cave myotis, which is a myotis species found in the Southwest that has a very similar echolocation characteristics as Indiana bats and northern long-eared bats. If it was successful for that species, would the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service consider, well, I just lost my train here. I guess consider it for testing in the Midwest where Indiana bats are present.
Yeah, I would certainly think that would be appropriate if the echolocation biology of one species is very similar to another. I would say, yeah, definitely go for it. In this case, there's some uncertainty about how it works, so I would encourage maybe a permit mechanism to be in place and a take authorization mechanism be in place for that research. But I'm certainly open to that sort of thing.
Apologies for the interruption. We're getting a lot of feedback on the audience end. If speakers might just mute themselves in between their answers, it could reduce the feedback that the audience is hearing. Sorry again for the interruption.
Thanks for letting us know, Shana. Okay, so a question came in regarding the painting of blades. And I mentioned that a study was recently published and released about a month ago. So the question is, what would you say are the next steps to research and regulation of this type of research? Yeah, so this again is kind of open to everybody, and provide your perspectives on the challenges and opportunities for kind of replicating that type of study.
First
I
off,
think the study you referred to is from Norway, and so I think that you have some very unique light conditions and long winters and stuff like that potentially is an issue. And some of the birds that they were looking for was a grouse, among others. And I would be concerned whether the findings would replicate to mainland US based on just the little bit I have looked at it.
yeah, I think there are a number of regulatory hurdles you're going to have to get over before you can paint a blade a color other than what the FAA specifies at this moment. I think there's 2 colors that they allow. You didn't even know this until earlier this week, but and the perception of the neighbors. I mean, public perception is going to be big. That's going to make those blades much more noticeable.
I think I'll stay in my bat lane for this one. I don't know that painting the blades applies to bats, so I'll abstain.
Okay. So we just have just a little bit more time, and I want to kind of drive home your thoughts on. We talk about a lot of hurdles and processes that go into place. There are regulatory processes, study design processes, logistics, and engineering processes. From each of your perspectives, what's a recipe for success in doing research to validate technology, minimization technologies? Amber, do you want to start us off on this one?
Sure. I would say that a logical progression from proof of concept to pilot study to larger deployment to farm scale deployment, and having a clear plan to going from this really great idea to here's how it works in the field over the long term. Thinking through all of that as you're doing research and as you're beginning to test something new, perhaps. I feel that that is a really strong component of success. That combined with understanding the why it works, as well as the how and the what you've measured in the field.
Kai, your thoughts?
I think that for turbine manufacturers, ease of operation is a big concern. It's great to have a system that works from the biology perspective, but as Greg also pointed out, you need to be able to access it. You can't get up to the tips very easily. How often do you need to replace it? Is it going to be prohibitive and increase the cost of operation significantly? That's a big concern. And it's a little bit of a chicken and egg. We need to get some stuff out there before we can test it out and see how it works. But we also need to be as sure as possible that is serviceable when it gets out there.
When it comes to technology, I think a lot of it falls on the turbine manufacturer to make it something that doesn't have to be installed after the fact. I mean, there's a lot of turbines on the ground now, but there's going to be a lot of repowering going on in the next 10 years. So a lot of these turbines are going to be replaced. So that technology just needs to be installed. And as far as the testing of the technology, I think the more testing, the more research we do, the easier it gets. We learn as we go. And so hopefully, as we do this research, we can figure out what we can do to make it easier and smoother.
Okay, great. Well, thanks again to you all for taking the time to prepare your presentations and speak with us today and answer questions. Just in concluding this webinar, I want to remind everybody that we've got 2 more in the webinar series, with the next one being on November 10th. And if you have any questions with respect to the series, you can email Shana or Pasha at Defenders, and they'll respond. And so with that, thanks everybody for attending, and we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Have a good day.
Thank you very much.
Thanks all.